Next speaker, Jack McManus. Jack likes to point out that if you're going to go visit him or pick him up at the airport, please don't yell, "Hi, Jack!" Jack currently lives behind enemy lines in Boston, so he has a great vantage point to let us know exactly what those enemy plans are. Jack is a graduate of Holy Cross, which is currently today one of the few bastions of reason and sense, especially on economic matters. They've really got a strong economics department there. In fact, a number of our supporters in Ohio that are graduates of Holy Cross, that's to their great credit, and you can understand that they have a background in true free market enterprise. Jack is the current president of the John Birch Society, has been on staff, since the 60s, right? Is a former U.S. Marine, and and truly on the subject of the United Nations, from a standpoint of freedom and liberty, there is no greater expert on the issue. Jack has literally written the book on the topic, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Jack McManus. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be here in Pennsylvania. Is that right? Pennsylvania? No. I wanted you all to know that before I could come here, your chairman, Mr. Clymer, demanded to see my birth certificate. I passed, right? Even though I was born in what some people consider to be a foreign country. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Somebody else did. Right. Well, I know we're rushed for time here, so we're going to get right into it. Are we ready with the... No, we're not. There we are. Now hit the... there we go. This is down. I'm using a... Yeah, right. Okay, we're going to have a slide presentation here. My topic is the United Nations. I would suspect that there's nobody in the room that is partisan for it, but I may be able to provide you some information you haven't heard before about it. And the John Birch Society, of course, has been in existence since 1958. I think Robert Welsh said we're going to start to get us out of the UN program in 1960. Right? So we've had a lot of people throughout the country who have benefited from our campaign against the UN, and that's what I'm here to continue. Okay, can we move the next slide? Here we go. There's the building. That is the United Nations headquarters. We've already stated that when we get them out of here and out of the United States, that we may take over that building as the international headquarters of the John Birch Society. But it was, as you can see, it was built on land donated by a very famous American family, the Rockefellers, all right? Now that says plenty because they knew what the UN was and what it would do. Okay, can we bump ahead now? The United Nations, of course, is for world government. And I contend that nationhood is something that is very important. In fact, I contend that nationhood began at the Tower of Babel. And that's a depiction of the Tower of Babel put together by a Belgian, a Flemish guy, I guess, way back in the 1600s. When those people back in antiquity decided to form a world government, they did so at the Tower of Babel. They were going to build a monument all the way to heaven and supplant God. Right? And so God intervened. And you all know this. You know the confusion of the tongues. All of a sudden, some people could talk to each other, and they couldn't talk to anybody else. And those people went off and formed a nation. And then this group did, over here, and then this group here. The beginning of nationhood occurred at the Tower of Babel. And it was the work of God Almighty, which I contend means that God didn't want world government. He didn't then, and I don't think he wants it today. All right, move on. Next. All right. So world government has been the goal of a lot of people over the years. Some of you know about Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati, formed on May 1st of 1776, which is why communists and socialists always celebrate May Day, and most of them don't know it. It went from Weishaupt to Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian revolutionary who formed the Carbonari movement. And he set up young Italy, and then young Germany, and young France, and young Belgium, and young America. There was a young America, started by this rascal, right? Now, keep in mind the name of Mazzini is going to come back. We go from Mazzini to Karl Marx. Karl Marx, of course, is the plagiarist who wrote the Communist Manifesto. It wasn't his work, he stole it. And he's the father of communism and socialism. Right? And there are some people who say, well, no, communism's bad, socialism's bad. Well, we don't like it, but it's not as bad. I contend it's worse. Right? Try and get this point. If a communist seizes control, he does so suddenly, and he hasn't destroyed resistance. If a socialist seizes control, he does so because he gets you to choose it. And in the process, he destroys resistance. The socialist route to totalitarianism, to me, is more dangerous than the communist route. They both end up, that's a point I want you all to remember, and when you have the exam later on tonight, I'm going to check it off and make sure everybody. We go from Karl Marx to communism and socialism, and we skip ahead a few others, and then we come to Edward Mandell House, the man I consider to be the arch conspirator of the 20th century. Wilson's chief advisor, Wilson's alter ego, he called him. Okay? We'll go to, this is a wonderful book written by Edward Mandell House, right? He wrote the book, incidentally, at his summer home in Massachusetts. Right? That book lays it out. It's the revolutionary program, and it was done in 1912, 1913, and because of that book, he was given the task of finding a suitable man to run for president of the United States, and he's the one that got Wilson nominated and elected. Right? All right, go next. What did Edward Mandell House call for in his book? Well, the first important thing to note is that the dedicatory quote is from Giuseppe Mazzini. And I think that is extremely significant. Right? All right? He was the top advisor to Wilson and FDR. Right? The FDR connection isn't well known. FDR won the Democrat nomination in 1932 on a conservative platform. Because he said, oh, this is my platform. Are we lying? Right? Don't they all? Right? He left the convention in Chicago after getting the nomination and headed back east. And he went right past his own home in New York State up to Massachusetts to visit Edward Mandell House in his summer home in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Roosevelt had been given a copy of Edward Mandell House's book by his own mother in 1920. And so he was a disciple of House just as much as Wilson, although it's not as obvious. Right? So what did he call for in the book? He sought socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, and that's a direct quote right out of the book. He despised the U.S. Constitution. He advocated income tax and the Federal Reserve. We got them both in 1913. He proposed world government, and he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. You can see why I consider this man to be the arch conspirator of the 20th century. Okay? 1919, the U.S. Senate voted whether or not to join the League of Nations. That was a project of Wilson and House, the beginning of a world government organization. They tried to get the U.S. involved in it. The U.S. Senate debated the matter for 9 months and said no. Now keep in mind that it took 9 months and they said no. When we get to the UN, you'll see it's a lot fewer days and they said yes. Okay, jump ahead. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste, isn't it? All right, this is Pearl Harbor. Was that a crisis? You betcha. Right? And it was a terrible thing to waste, so they didn't waste it. Right? We got involved in World War II, and one of the goals was immediately to start the ball rolling towards the world government. 1942, 1 month after Pearl Harbor. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, 26 nations issued a formal declaration of the United Nations. That's the first time the term was used. 1943, Allied nations meet, US, UK, USSR, and China, and agree to form a world government. At that point, China was in the hands of good people, decent people. 1944, the famous Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington. That's a big estate. And that's where the initial draft of the UN Charter came. Right? In 1945, the San Francisco Conference, delegates from 50 different nations produced the final United Nations Charter. Now, I sometimes ask audiences, I know that an awful lot of Americans haven't read the Constitution of the United States, right? And I'll chide them for not having done so. Now, I'll ask for a show of hands. How many have read the United Nations Charter? Right? Well, we got a handful of people here who have. Jump to the next slide. Who's the author of it? Who's the author of the United Nations Charter? Alger Hiss. Right? Later found out to be a secret communist. 2 authors of the UN Charter. Andrei Gromyko, the USSR, was an open communist. Everybody knew he was a communist. Right? Alger Hiss, the United States, a secret communist. There were people who knew he was a communist. In fact, 7 separate messages went from the FBI to the president warning that this man was disreputable and so forth. They were all ignored. Right? And at the UN founding, there were 16 secret communists. I could list the names for you if you'd like, but won't bother. Council on Foreign Relations members in our delegation at the founding of the UN, there were 43 of them. One of them, Nelson Rockefeller, by the way. Okay. 1945, the Senate finally given a chance to vote. Do we or don't we support the United Nations? And they debated the matter for a mere 6 days. Now, 9 months, they said no to the League of Nations. 6 days, they approved UN membership by a vote of 89-2. That should be all on one line. I don't know what happened there. 89-2. Only 2 senators said no. I'm sure you've heard their names. You all know who the 2 were. Shipstead and Langer. He does, right? Hendrik Shipstead of Minnesota, William Langer of North Dakota. Right? Well-known names, well-known to Curtis. Not too many others, right? Now, Hiram Johnson of California was a senator at the time, and he would have voted no. Illness kept him from participating. So, there were only those few who said no. And we got into the United Nations. Now, we have a copy of the Charter of the United Nations, and we have to ask you for a couple of bucks to get it. So it's at the book table. If you've never read this, you owe it to yourself. And you can see we've made notations along here about some of the important things that you should know about. Okay, next, here it is, the UN Charter. I'll point out here that Article 1 mentions peace 6 times. Article 2, that follows right after it, talks about how we can go to war. Okay? The peace organization goes to war. Okay, jump ahead. The word peace appears 6 times. Article 2 discusses application of enforcement measures. That's war. And Chapter 7 authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. That's the peace organization, right? No, not really. Okay, jump ahead. All right, now, just ask yourself, all right, you're a United States Senator. It's the summer of 1945. You're presented with the United Nations Charter and asked to say yes to it, right? You read through it, you get to Article 25. The entire Article 25. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Would you, as a United States Senator, have signed on to that? Does that not trump the Constitution of the United States? But they did. See, they only had 6 days to debate the matter, so I guess Most of them didn't read it. Now, one of my older heroes is a man named Robert Taft, senator from Ohio, Mr. Republican, the conservative leader. He unfortunately voted for entry into the United Nations. It was only a year or two later that he came out and said the UN is a trap, let's go it alone. Right? But the die had been cast. All right, Article 43. Where do they get the military forces? All right? All members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including rights of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. All members of the United Nations. So they pass a resolution, right? All members are committed to follow and to supply troops. Right? How many do? Very few. The United States always does. The United Nations will. And that's got to stop. All right. In December of 1945, now the charter was passed in the summer, right? And in December of 1945, Congress passed the United Nations Participation Act. How many have ever heard of that? Right? You'll be interested to know that Ron Paul's bill, 1146, to get us out of the United Nations, first thing it says is repeal the United Nations Participation Act. Right? Ron Paul is aware. How many others, all right? Now, go back. There are two parts to this United Nations Participation Act. All right? Part one, it says the president must have approval of Congress to supply troops for a UN standing army. The UN has always wanted a standing army. They never had it. They don't have their own forces. Every time they want to do something, they have to get some from here and some from here, mostly from the United States, of course. All right? So part one has never been even entertained by Congress. Part two, however, and this is the important part, the president shall not be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. Right? 1945. House approved it 344 to 15. Only 15 members of Congress. One of the great congresswoman actually at the time was Jessie Sumner from Illinois. And she spoke out very strongly about this. She was right on, but only 15. And then the Senate approved it by voice vote, and we now have the United Nations Participation Act. Now, so you know now how come a president can send troops anywhere he wants without the approval of Congress, right? And that goes on all the time. Okay, next one. Well, here's Robert Taft. The UN has become a trap. Let's go it alone. Well, all right, better late than never, Robert Taft, but would be better if you hadn't been late. Next. Okay, now, what about NATO? You go to the UN Charter, you'll see that the UN Charter calls for the creation of regional arrangements, they call it. Right? When NATO was proposed, Secretary of State Dean Acheson in the Truman administration, one of the worst lefties that ever graced the streets of Washington, D.C., right? He went before the Senate and he told them, he said, NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. What else do you need to know about it? Is that what it has done? Yes, right? So you go to the UN Charter and you see Articles 52, 3, and 4, the authorization for NATO, and the authorization for SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. That came later. Right? And it says in the UN Charter, the Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority. Have they been doing that? Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. Right. So NATO is a stepchild of the United Nations, always has been, as SEATO also a stepchild of the United Nations, always has been. SEATO's out of business now. But NATO continues to grow and become more important. Right? Korean War starts June 1950. North Korea invades South. The UN Security Council passes a resolution. All members send forces, right? The U.S. supplies troops. No declaration of war. President Truman asked about this. How can you do this without a declaration of war? See, this was 1950 when people still gave a darn about the Constitution, right? He said, we're not at war. This is a police action. He said, if I can send troops to NATO, which he had already done, I can send troops to Korea. Oh, didn't NATO really help to fill a void? Right? UN flags were flying all during the police action, the Korean War. How many in this room participated in that? Anybody? No, usually there's somebody, all right? UN flags were flying, right? And the state of war in Korea still exists. The war has never stopped, right? They stopped shooting, but the state of war still exists. We still have 39,000 troops in South Korea to protect them against the North, while the South Koreans are doing quite well, even exporting automobiles to the United States. Right? What a world. So, next, CEDAW, regional arrangement, that's the authorization to go to Vietnam. Right? President Lyndon Johnson was asked in 1967, how can we do this? He said, we are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the CEDAW Treaty to act to meet the common danger of aggression in Southeast Asia. So there was a United Nations resolution. Okay? We got to protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam. And who sent the troops? The United States again, right? Now, there were a couple of other countries that sent a little contingent here and there, but not that many. Okay, move on. Desert Storm, 1991. All right, we've gone through Korea, we've gone through Vietnam. Desert Storm, 1991. President George W. Bush, that's the elder Bush. The Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order. And that world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations proves to be effective. Now, you may remember that that war started when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And the United Nations came out with a resolution. We got to protect Kuwait. So who sent 500,000 troops to protect Kuwait? Corrupt, totalitarian caliphate, or whatever they want to call it. Is that what the United States military is all about? Shouldn't be. So they got them out of Kuwait, and then all of a sudden the war stopped. And a lot of people were shaking their heads. Why, how come you didn't go all the way to Baghdad and get Saddam Hussein? Well, the war stopped suddenly because the UN Security Council authorized only forcing Iraq's forces out of Kuwait. And once they had done that, bingo, the war's over. Right? And that's when the neocons and the Bush administration, way back in that period, Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, they started planning the next war against Iraq. Right? Okay, next one. The next war against Iraq started in March of 2003. So we're talking here about something that happened at the International Relations Committee, October 3, 2002, 6 months before the war started. Ron Paul, member of the committee in International Relations, it used to be Foreign Affairs, and now it's back to Foreign Affairs. Right? It's the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House. He stood up and he said, Mr. Chairman, I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Wow, right? What a burr under their saddle. Okay, so what happened? They all swore an oath to the Constitution, didn't they? Right? And Ron's simply bringing up Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 11, I think it is. Congress alone has the power to declare war. Right? Okay, well, what did the chairman say? The chairman, Henry Hyde of Illinois, largely known as a great conservative. Sure, right? He pointed right to Ron and he said, Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to a modern society. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore. A conservative, right? Right? Now, I had some friends in Illinois, and I said, write him a letter and ask him if the part that says that he should be paid a salary is anachronistic. They did. He never answered. Right? He never answered. Next. Okay, so let's summarize. The wars after World War II. Korean War, obvious UN control. The Vietnam War, CEDAW, not so obvious, but UN control. Desert Storm, authorized by the Security Council, UN again. Iraq, 2003 until who knows when, authorized by the Security Council. Afghanistan, we started that in 2001, and it goes on, and now it's under NATO. Right? Am I saying that all of these wars were United Nations operations? Yes, indeed I am. Right? And I think I've given you enough evidence to back up the charge. Okay? Now, excuse me, let's shift away from the military aspect of things and talk very briefly here about other parts of the United Nations. This is a United Nations flowchart, and I know you can't read it, right? It's fuzzy and it's small type, and I just want to show you that it exists. And how did I come up with that? I walked into the belly of the beast in New York City, and they gave me a copy. So I said, well, can I have a couple more of those? I got a couple more. I got some other interesting things, too. All right, now, if you go through that, you see that the United Nations has its paws into every aspect of your life. Right? For instance, that UN flowchart tells us that they're in education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, not military science, two separate things, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, and I didn't even mention them all. The UN is in every aspect of our lives. Right? More and more reasons to get us out. Yeah. Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out 1948. Oh, this is wonderful. Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in this. Right? Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as the wife of the President of the United States, personally joined over 100 Communist Front organizations. Right? You remember they used to imitate FDR. I hate war. Eleanor hates war. And I hate Eleanor. Oh, no. No, back it up. Back it up. All right? The Article 29, this is throughout. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. So the UN takes upon itself the power to limit the rights that every one of us feel are inherent and unalienable and so forth. And then they say these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Okay, jump ahead. UN versus the Bill of Rights. The United Nations says rights are granted but subject to limitations. U.S. Bill of Rights, rights are God-given and Congress shall make no law. Could you have it more different? Right? Right? That in itself is reason to get out of the UN. Okay. In 1966, they came out with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it's the same thing all over again. Right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now the Covenant on Human Rights, and it's the same thing. Right? Again, United Nations rights are granted but subject to limitations. And the U.S. Bill of Rights said rights are God-given and Congress shall make no law. No American should have anything to do with the United Nations. No American. Now, back on the book table back there, you're going to see a book that I wrote that has stirred a little bit of controversy. It's called William F. Buckley, Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment. Right? I started watching William Buckley way back in the 60s. And I filled a couple of file drawers with stuff about this man. And it's a story and a half, really. Buckley, at one point, accepted appointment to a United Nations commission He served in it. He praised the United Nations and so forth. And that's only one of many reasons why this man could be called the Pied Piper for the establishment. So if you want to get a copy of that book, maybe he might still be your hero. I hope not, but maybe you'll take a look at the book and you'll see differently. Okay. All right, so let's make a few conclusions here. Conclusion number one. The United Nations is not taking over the United States. Why? Because the United States is being delivered to the United Nations. That's a big distinction. Big distinction. Right? It's not the power of the UN, it's the power of the people within our country who are constantly making us more and more subservient to the United Nations. Okay? Conclusion number two. Membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with the maintenance of independence for the United States and the freedom for the American people. Right? That should be obvious by now. Okay. All right, conclusion number three. Reform it? No. No, you don't reform cancer, do you? You get rid of it, if you can. Right? All right, reduce payments? Oh, there's some time every once in a while, oh yeah, we ought to cut down on our payments. No. The only reduction is down to zero or it's meaningless. Right? Find a friendlier Secretary General? Right? You go over a list of the Secretary General of the United Nations, you've got one socialist, one communist, one socialist, another socialist. One was a Nazi, right? Right? And so on. No, so we don't get a favorable Secretary General and then relax. No. So what's the real conclusion? Down at the bottom it said get us out, didn't it? Right? Right? H.R. 1146, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, Ron Paul, and we mentioned it on the back here. I should have made a slide out of this, but I didn't. If you're close enough, you can see here that we've got the UN General Assembly meeting, and they have a new logo. Right? Their new logo is a map of the United States with the slash mark through it. Right? That's part of what you'll get if you get yourself a copy of the charter. All right? Ron Paul's measure provides for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations. So please, go back to your homes, wherever you come from, get a hold of your congressmen and your friends and so forth, and start more agitation. Co-sponsor 1146. Get behind this 1146. We're going to be coming out with more and more things about this. There actually was a videotape made of me giving this talk to a small group up in Wisconsin, and it's on the internet. I don't know where, but maybe you can find it. Okay, you got any more? jbs.org. There's the John Birch Society for you in a nutshell. That's one of our main identifying causes, I guess you could say. It's something that has endeared us to some Americans and made us the absolute enemy of some people who call themselves Americans and aren't. Okay, so are you ready? Get us out. Thank you very much.